In 2020, George Pell emerged from a Melbourne prison a free man. His convictions for child sex abuse quashed by the highest court in the land.
When the High Court came down and literally threw it out, I think he was as delighted as anybody else with that outcome.
He spent his final days in the Vatican, away from the spotlight and controversies that had followed him for much of his life.
Pell was a mighty figure in the Catholic Church. No Australian priest has risen as high as him. And no high prelate in the Catholic Church fell as far.
In 1996, 30 years after being ordained, George Pell was named Archbishop of Melbourne, where he set up a protocol to investigate and deal with complaints of child sex abuse in the Archdiocese.
It's a matter of regret that the Catholic Church has taken some time to come to grips with this sexual assault issue adequately.
George Pell, tell the truth!
The Melbourne response was the first of its kind in the world, but would later be the subject of intense and widespread criticism that it offered inadequate support to victims.
The Melbourne response had one overriding purpose, and that was to safeguard the assets of the Church. In Melbourne, you were lucky if you got 50 grand, signed a piece of paper that said you could never sue the Church. It was a device to protect the Church.
At the time the Melbourne response was established, it was the first of any such compensation. The taking of steps to address that was important at that time. Now we have different processes and that has been a learning experience over the last couple of decades.
Cardinal Pell went on to serve as Archbishop of Sydney. In 2014, he was appointed to a major role at the Vatican, tasked with cleaning up the Church's finances.
The Pope, was absolutely right to appoint him to get to the bottom of the money trails of the Vatican, and he was doing brilliant work.
The Cardinal is, I think, been one of the great churchmen of Australia and internationally. He, over many years, has been a forthright defender of the faith.
But he continued to face questions about his knowledge of child sex abuse among clergy back in Australia decades before. In 1993, after Father Gerald Ridsdale was charged with indecent assault against 9 boys, George Pell accompanied him to court.
I had some status as an auxiliary bishop, and I was asked to appear with the ambition that this would lessen the term of punishment, perhaps lessen his time in jail.
Ridsdale later pleaded guilty to sexually assaulting more than 50 children over decades.
Pell knew what was happening around him. Pell's authority and power in the Church was that you didn't put things over him. He knew the score. Pell had a choice: to have a career in the Church or to look after the kids around him. And he chose the career in the Church.
Decades later, the Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse would find Pell knew of child sex abuse by clergy as far back as the 70s, but failed to take adequate action to address it.
Cardinal, what in your view were the reasons behind so many child sexual abusers aggregating in Ballarat East in the 1970s?
I think that it was a disastrous coincidence.
Pell said the findings were not supported by evidence.
Welcome to 7:30.
By this stage, Pell had already faced serious allegations of his own.
7:30 changes the focus of that discussion to reveal a series of allegations levelled against the Cardinal himself.
In 2016, 7:30 broadcast allegations that Pell himself was accused of child sexual abuse.
The seemingly innocent game with Father Pell began to conceal something else beneath the water.
His hand touching your genitals and stuff on the outside of your bathers or your shorts, and then that slowly became hand down the front of the pants.
Victoria Police charged George Pell with child sex offences dating from his time in Ballarat in the 1970s, as well as his term as Archbishop in Melbourne in the 90s. Pell faced the charges in 2 separate trials, pleading not guilty in both. The prosecution ultimately withdrew its case in the trial relating to the charges dating from the 70s, but he was convicted in the other trial of 5 counts of child sexual abuse and sentenced to 6 years jail.
I, like a great many lawyers, thought it was probably the lowest day for civil liberties and criminal justice in Australia.
George Pell always maintained his innocence and appealed all the way to the High Court, which in April 2020 quashed his convictions, allowing him to walk free after 404 days behind bars.
He himself, I think, has treasured and relished this time, these last couple of years, where he's been able to engage with many people but not carrying the responsibilities that come with that.
The High Court's response has to be respected. It was a unanimous response to throw out the charges against Pell. Under the rules in Victoria, the victims of sexual assault, or those who complain about sexual assaults, have their evidence heard in private. And that meant that the public has never been given a chance to assess the strength of that man's claims.
George Pell's legacy in death is sure to be as divisive as his life.
I actually think history will be kind to George Pell. Oddly enough, because I think the focus as history goes on will probably be on him partly as a cardinal, but fundamentally on the horrid miscarriage of justice that occurred to him.
There's going to be a tussle now between those who say this man has died and he should be paid respect, and those who say this man has died and now the truth can be told about him. And I doubt very much whether George Pell is going to rest in peace, because there is still so much unknown and undecided about his career.